Okay, you are more than welcome to start off by pausing and reading our 12 rules of reading biblical text. And if you don't like the 12 rules, well, this isn't the place for you. If you don't understand the 12 rules, go listen to the audiobook that is uploaded on this channel because I don't have time to go over it every time. These are Bible study series that go pretty in depth. Warning, we're not language watching people. We're very salt of the earth, down to earth. It also does not follow the politically correct patterns of modern preachers and teachers. So if you're looking for that, also definitely not the place for you. Well, we're moving from Meet Ephraim series to Meet David series because everything sort of, mishmashes together. And you back in the book that I wrote about all of the things that we've learned and sort of putting it together in a big cohesive piece. I want you to think of King David as like a pissant warlord, because that's what he was. Okay. So we chose Negan as the representation of um King David. And there's lots of reasons for that. I also do a lot of referring back to a book that I wrote and read aloud on this channel that sort of takes you through the entire arc. So if I refer back, chances are I'm referring back to things in that book that you haven't listened to. So if you're confused, try that first. Let's see. We are doing Psalm 1 today. And this one is pretty straightforward. But here we go. I have so much, I always have so much to say when we're talking about God. All right. Psalm 1, I'm going to go ahead and read it for you. I have no idea what version of this is. Probably the NIV because that's the one that always pops up first. But here we go. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. And those 6 little short verses, there's action packed as usual. So, the first thing I kind of wanted to touch on, first of all, is this idea of blessed. And what the heck do we mean when we say blessed? Well, most people in the West are sort of selfish. I mean, we just, no offense, but like we have a really selfish, egocentric, self centered culture that we're living in, and much more so than not all, but many, many other cultures around the world that more focuses on, community and extended family and duty and all. We don't really have much of that left for whatever various reasons throughout time has made our cultures very me focused. So we tend to think of blessed as like shit's going right all the time, right? Like, oh, you're blessed if you're wealthy, or you're blessed if you drive a fucking amazing car, or you're blessed because shit never goes wrong, right? Count your blessings kind of things. But in the Hebrew, it actually sort of means worthy of praise. Okay. So, like, you're doing the right thing, you're worthy of praise. High five, fucking badasses. So, think of it that way. A lot of your, TV preachers who are like, you got to send the money, don't stop at the five. Reach down into your pocket and fuck the 10, fuck the 20, inflation, go for the 100. Because if you bless this ministry, God will bless you. And yeah, that's true. Like what you put out is going to come back. However, comma, that's not what this means. This doesn't mean like financial blessings or like favors. We think of God as like our cosmic bellboy who's going to do a bunch of shit for us and like bless us with what we want. That's not the definition of blessing at all. So think of it as worthy of praise. Like, dude, I'm giving you a high five. Is you're gonna get a big ass high five if you're not walking in step with the wicked, okay, or standing in the way that sinners take, or in the company of mockers. I wanted to point out to you the wicked. It's not just the devil, right? It's not Satan. It's the wicked. The language is Hasatan, which is Ha is the Satan, the enemy. We have to really unprogram ourselves from thinking of Satan as running around with a fucking pitchfork. Okay, it's an energy, a spirit of evil. Okay, who infects. Think of it as like an infectious disease. The Satan is going to infect the people to act wickedly. Okay, so it's the enemy or the wicked one or the Hasatan. Okay, okay. I also want you to notice the language here is or, but sort of kind of not really. I want to point out, even though it says or, the ors kind of take our sight away in verse 1 of the way that those verbs are aligned, where it's who does not walk, stand, and then sit. So this is kind of these verbs are progressive, and I don't mean intense necessarily. I mean in your actions, right? So if you're going to walk among the douchebags, eventually you're going to be standing among the douchebags and learning more about the douchebags and becoming friends with the douchebags. And then finally, you're just going to sit down and have smoke with the douchebags, and then you become part of them. So verse 1 is just saying, you know what? Just stay the fuck away from those douchebags. We don't need them. Just don't even go near them. And that's not in the way of, I'm the first to always say, like, most of my clients are fucking assholes, dude. I don't really work with a lot of mainstream church going cookie baking types. Soccer mom types, as you can imagine. No, God put me here to minister to the douchebags because that's where I spent most of my life. So I'm way more comfortable in a dirty, fucking hooker infested, cracky back alley in New Orleans than I am sitting in a pew in a fucking Episcopalian church baking cookies on Sunday. But guess what? The dirtbags and the bikers and the cartel people and the slime bees and the druggies and the criminals, they need saving too. So I think God builds up people like me who are fucking total assholes and who aren't shocked by much and have been through it all and who have seen it all to sort of go into those places and minister and do deliverance for those people. And that's really where my main focus is now. But that doesn't mean that I'm hanging out with them. I did at one time so I can relate to them, but you're not going to find me. I know this is crazy, you guys. You don't find me in dive bars anymore unless I'm sitting there doing deliverance and had to meet someone in the parking lot because they're freaking out. But like, I'm not hanging out in pool halls anymore. And, that's just not me. But on the other hand, to be fair, um, God still loves to put my ass in interesting places with interesting people, and I'll just give a quick example of that. The world shut down during Rona, and I was out in Saudi. I was working out in Saudi at the time, and the whole entire world closed. And they're like, okay, here's the deal. You can stay here and keep your job and keep your house and everything and keep the contract, but borders are closed, nothing's open. So we don't know when you'll ever get out, and your family can never come in and see you. So it could be a month, it could be 10 years, like we just don't know. And this was right at the beginning, of Rona. And so they said, we've got some flights going out that, the Crown Prince, MBS, and Trump arranged together, and we can put you on the Trump flight and you can get evacuated back to America. And if you take us up on it, we'll go ahead and end your contract amicably. We'll give you your service bonus and pay you the entire 2 years of your contract. But you have to leave now because we're not going to be running these flights forever. There's limited number of seats, so get your seat, take the money and run, or like stay here, your choice. So of course, I took the money and left. And I really wanted to go. I remember it was like a 6-week window, and I was waiting for something to open. Like, maybe Greece will open, or like Albania or Morocco or Singapore, something on that side of the world. I didn't want to be on this side of the world. And, the 6-week window was closing and nothing was opening, and I wasn't getting my way. And no matter what I did, I couldn't figure out what to do because I certainly didn't want to be back in America with no car, no job, 2 suitcases, and start all over in the American economy during, the summer of love of 2020 was not my thing. And also, when you're out of the country, I don't even know how to say this one, but when you're out of the country for so many days, you don't have to pay income tax when you're working in a GCC country. And I think I got sent back like, 6 days before my daily limit. So I'm like, I don't want to be there. So I traveled through the US. Um, and I was looking for somewhere to go, and I couldn't make it work because every single border was closed. And what I should have done earlier, me trying to control the situation as we always do. I just said, you know what, God, just shit. God, put me where you want me. I don't know where I'm supposed to be. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. I have zero plan. So you know what? We're gonna chuck it in the fucking bucket, and you just figure this shit out, and I'll go and do whatever you need me to go and do. Well, there was that. But nothing opened, and literally, the only country that was open was Mexico. So I flew back through Washington, set foot in Washington for about 2 seconds, and then went immediately to I was in Cancun for a week, and I'm like, okay, now what do I do? Because I had sold everything, didn't have a car, didn't have a house, had nothing. 2 suitcases and me. So I'm down in Mexico, and I'm in Cancun, and it was like I was the only person there. Um, and I found a Airbnb that called back immediately. So I got on a plane and went over, and I ended up not just in Mazatlan, but the Sinaloa in Sinaloa, which is the Sinaloa drug cartel. And I ended up in a house off the coast of Mazatlan. It's not really an island, it's a peninsula, but they call it the island. And I ended up in a cartel run house. I was renting a cartel house during Rona, right on the beach. Beautiful, lovely. It was a great house. And just to be clear, it wasn't a cartel run house. That's Cliff Notes. It was a family that was affiliated with the cartel, with the Sinaloa cartel. Um, so it's still interesting situation, nevertheless. But we just, lovingly refer to those months as the cartel house. And my neighbors and people that lived with me in the house, in that apartment, in that condo, were fantastic. And I met some of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. It was this giant house, and it was broken up into, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 6 condos within the house, or 6 areas within the house, 6 different, individual apartments, if you will. And it was freaking awesome. The people there were amazing. And we had lots of supernatural things happening that we, you know, sort of like Wonder Twins power activated down there. It was a really interesting group of people that I needed as part of my growth right in that moment, in regard to spiritual warfare, and very spiritually aligned, if so to speak. And it's funny because the entire, I can't really call it a jungle, but the entire, when my daughter came to visit, she called it like King Kong land, because it's very, very rural. Chickens running around and like jungle foliage right behind you that goes right down to the beach. So we're pretty rural on this island, and you'd have to take a little boat to get to the main town of Mazatlan to like do your shopping and grocery shopping and go to dinner. And like there was nothing. We were very remote. I mean, there's no paved roads. There were really, very few cars, a few pickup trucks. The local guys would kind of hang out at the ferry dock, if you will, at the boat dock, and, you know, take you back to whatever houses you were in on the quote unquote island. Lots of mud when it would rain, and the internet went out all the time, and it was awesome. It was flipping awesome. And people just rode ATVs around, or horses. It was amazing. It was amazing. In this cartel run house. And behind us, and the cartel people were lovely. They're lovely. But like they have to check you out a little bit first, and know what you're about. Um so I ended up in a cartel house, interestingly, and have just stories beyond stories, among stories, of all kinds of supernatural and spiritual warfare that I learned and that went on during my time in Sinaloa, and the different sacrifice and Satanism and satanic ritual abuse that was happening in the backyard. I mean, not literally the backyard, but up the mountain behind the rural house in the quote unquote jungly areas of the island. There's a lot of shit that goes on there. And so we saw a lot of things, we experienced a lot of things, and there was a lot of spiritual warfare along with a lot of deliverance. So, I don't choose to hang out with cartel people or, you know, douchebag places, but it takes one to know one. And so a lot of times God puts me in situations that I had nothing to do with. And I'm just like, oh, look where I am again. I'm in the middle of a biker bar and suddenly I've got like 20 people that I'm healing. So those things happen to me often. And it's because, Jesus said, I have not come so the righteous are saved, but for the sinners. And so that still applies. But that doesn't mean, you know, I'm one of them and I'm hanging out with them. I think it takes one to know one. And I think there's a relatability with that. I'm always the one that, when we lived in New Orleans, the scuzzy people would always come right up to me, you know, trying to cop a smoke or trying to, strike up a conversation or, hey, I can't get whatever freaking cigarettes on my EBT card. So how about I buy you the milk and you buy me the smokes and we'll trade? And like I always had, the janky people approaching me, and I'm like, why do they keep approaching me? I thought I looked like a soccer mom. No, it's an energy. It's an energy, and it takes one to know one. But that said, that doesn't mean, you know, associating versus befriending. And I need to keep that very, very clear that there is a separation there between loving people and being a part of a culture and going in and being part of the darkness versus being amidst the darkness and standing there as the light in that darkness for a specific purpose. So always know the difference and always keep your energy and your boundaries very solid and very clear. And that's what those sentences remind me of. So this is saying like don't really be around them. Don't hate them, but you don't want to immerse yourself in that world because it eats you up pretty quick. Anyways, so that's the first one. It's just stay the fuck away from them. People also in modern Western Christianity think that, you love your neighbor stuff. We talked about that in a previous psalm and how to visualize that piece. It doesn't mean like, go to dinner and fuck them and hang out with them and marry them. Throughout the entire Old Testament, God was constantly telling his people, don't fucking go near those assholes. Why are you marrying them? And it's because they infect, right? You don't want to go around sick people and allow them to infect you and adopt their lifestyle. So, sort of, that's what this is saying. And quite honestly, you don't really have to be nice to them either. Everyone has this big hippie, love your neighbor, hippie Jesus. Jesus was no fucking hippie, dude. He wasn't nice. And I wish people understood. Jesus wasn't nice. He chased people out of with a fucking whip, right? He turned over tables. He called them broods of vipers. I mean, come on, Jesus wasn't nice. He would look at the scuzzy girl from the next door occult worshiping false god worshiping town, and he's just like, the fuck do you want, lady? Like you're. And he was kind of condescending to her, and she's like, oh, you're the Messiah and I want to be healed. And he's like, you have faith. You're not a fucking dirty heathen. Come on over. He wasn't nice to the heathens and the pagans. Loving someone and being nice to them is two different things. Loving someone, praying for someone, working with someone, and then not having boundaries and understanding who they are and who they're with and what path they're on are two different things. You don't have to go out and insult and disparage. Like we're not on fucking Twitter. But I think people really misunderstand that. One of the first things I did when COVID hit was I went from like, thousands of friends down to like hundreds, and then I fucking cut it down. There's like 38 people on my social media lists of people. Here's why. I lived in the Middle East. Middle Easterners don't fuck around with strangers, right? If they were going to lock us up in fucking prison camps because my daughter wasn't vaccinated, guess what? Ain't none of those motherfucking liberals who were on my friends list that live in fucking Vermont and are stupid enough to support Bernie Sanders. They don't need to know where I am. They don't need to know what I'm doing. Because I'll tell you, as soon as someone goes knocking on their door and says, "Tell me where that bitch, we can lock her up," they're fucking folding like a cheap ass suit.
And that is definitely something that you learn living in the Middle East, where there is constantly like war and people turning against each other. And, I mean, they have these entire networks. It sort of reminds me of study hall, like when you're passing notes in study hall, and it's like the note goes across, 15 people to your friend over there in the corner. And that's really how they communicate. They have to have these things of trust. When I was in Egypt during the Arab Spring, when there was that giant, they took down when Sisi came into power, um, and they took down Morsi. I was there in the middle of the 8 million people in Cairo that were protesting. I was in the Arab Spring protests back when Obama was president. And, I remember my driver, had to call like 14 people along the way. We went to the Saqqara pyramids, which are in Dashur, which are way out of town. And, it was like, an hour and a half. I don't know how long it was. It was an hour and a half, but it took us like fucking half the day because, you have rebel groups who are ready to run at you with machetes and, chase down the car. And so they have these networks of people that they trust, and it's old school, man. It's like walkie-talkie shit and like passing notes in study hall. They don't blast themselves all over social media and invite someone over into the house just because like I knew them in third grade. Like that doesn't happen in the Middle East. It doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. And so perhaps a bit of my paranoia comes out of that, spending so much time in such a different culture and such a different war torn place where people there, it's a lot different. It's a lot different than here. And I think I brought some of that caution towards people and groups of people back with me. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
And I'm sorry if that sounds paranoid, but I don't need to be around them. I don't want to be around them. I'm not impressed. I keep to myself, go away. And that's really how it is in the Middle East. We're not friends with people just because. That's how they work out there. They'll be polite, they'll be kind, they'll even be generous and helpful. But that's not the same as love everybody and bring them into your fucking house. Like it takes a lot to get invited into the home of a person in the Middle East. And if you are, you are truly praiseworthy. So I think we have a warped view of healthy, spiritual, emotional, physical, and moral boundaries in our country. And I think a lot of people are really fucking pussies about it too. So that's my idea for verse one. Okay, but that's me. So Jesus is saying, don't be a fucking asshole with the assholes. All right, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord and who meditates on his law day and night.
Okay. The law, the law, the law. I think we go a little bit deeper into this in the Luke series, perhaps, which we haven't gotten to yet. But you can go back to the book because I'm sure I address it there somewhere. Um, you have to remember our post Babylonian redactors and how they put shit in to the Old Testament and called it God's law, right? So you've got redactor, biblical redactors, um, with your Pharisees and your law people and your scribes. And then, so man's law versus God's law. And a lot of times those get very confused. And we're not going down that rabbit hole, okay? But there is a difference between God's law and what is referred to in mainstream institutionalized religious movements, and also the like Hebrew roots movement people who get so trapped in this law thing because they don't understand the history and the rebellion against institutionalized religious movements. So basically, I'm just going to say in Christianity, no matter where you go, they're very confused about the law and the law. This comes from my favorite biblical asshole, Paul, with the law. And until you understand the history of the Babylonian, post-Babylonian redactors or editors, putting janky shit in there, I mean, in this just screams in my head the speech that quote unquote Stephen made in Acts, right? When he was stoned, when Saul of Tarsus was sort of the ringleader there, and they laid their coats at Saul's feet because they didn't want to get him all bloody and gross. And Saul was kind of overseeing the stoning of Stephen. Well, Stephen makes a speech there, and it's a lot of people really ignore it because they don't understand it. He's talking about, and we go over this when we go over this Stephen speech pretty in depth in Mayhem series, which we also haven't gotten to yet. But they're all coming. They're all coming. And how he says this weird thing when he's talking to the Pharisees, and he's like, "You who claim you were given the law by quote unquote angels or messengers of God, and that you can't even keep that law." And what is he referring to? What does that mean? Why is he, he's disparaging these people. He's not being nice in his speech, and they end up stoning him. Well, he's talking to the Jewish Pharisees. That's who he's talking to, Judean, post-Babylonian elites, Pharisees. And where does that come from? This law given by angels? Saul of Tarsus refers to the law given by angels, and don't go back to the law given by angels. Where does this come from? Well, that's actually a sect of Pharisees and in their belief in this cult. And it's interesting, we get into that a little more in Mayhem in that series, which looks much more deeply in the relationship between James and Paul. And we do the homilies and recognitions, and the how the Catholic Church came in and fucking changed a bunch of shit and burned all the evidence, and then like manuscripts just keep popping up. But we go through all of that. And so this really reminds me of that speech by Stephen when he's pointing out the law versus the law, and the law of God versus the law, quote unquote, that you say was given by angels, that was written in with Jeremiah, lying pen of the scribes. So it's all there, but people ignore these things because they don't understand them, and they're chasing Paul, so they can't look at it through the lens of Paul may or may not have actually been a Pharisee. But if he was indeed a Pharisee, he was one of these janky ass Pharisees that believed the Babylonian redactive law given by angels and not Moses. So a lot of times when Paul is talking about the law, he's not talking about 10 Commandments, Moses, that James and Jesus and all these other people are referring to, right? He's in the trap of the lying pen of the scribes, referred to in Jeremiah from the post-Babylonian redactors in that law. And that's a different law. And people don't get that. And calling it God's law, you're not going to understand that. Same thing with law of Moses, right? It's law of Moses, meaning 10 commandments, not law of the elites who came back from Babylon, wrote a bunch of shit in for the priesthood to retain control over the common people, and calling it the law of Moses. Those are two different things. So, but we're not going to go deep into that. But what I do want to point out is David, and one of the reasons David is one of my favorite Old Testament biblical characters, King David knew the difference. Okay. He is pre-Babylon, right? So he doesn't have to deal with the lying pen of the scribes and the institutionalized religion later to be called Judish, Jewish. I don't know. I don't know what to call it because it's certainly not the Jewish of today. Um, so we'll call it Babylonian elite Judaism. How about that? And so he didn't have exposure to that because David's way before that. But he did have exposure to, the temple sacrifice system was there, the janky religions of all the Canaanite people and the baby eaters around surrounding him in different lands, which is why God's like, don't be marrying those people because you're going to, their culture is going to bleed into yours and you'll start serving these janky ass gods and these janky ass practices. And so David knew the difference between religious institution law and God's law. And some people call that, spiritual, quote unquote, Torah versus oral written traditions of man stuff that bled its way into the Bible from the Pharisaical elites coming back from Babylon. So even if you take out the post-Babylonian redactors, right, and you look way back and put yourself into David's time, where the sacrifices are going on. And, David's like, if there's a sacrifice worthy, I would give it to you. When he had the whole Bathsheba incident, we'll get to that later. But he knew that the sacrificial system wasn't what God was looking for. He knew. He understood that. He understood the difference between ceremonial, religious, institutionalized traditions of man law versus God's law. And so I'm going to pose to you to consider David sings about, prays about, meditates on the law. Like David is all about the quote unquote law. And when you step out of Pollyanity and all of their different definitions, because Paul's yammering about the law all the time and he screws it up. But people who follow and trust and believe in Paul are like, Paul was an expert in the law. No, Paul was a freaking BSer. Paul was a used car salesman. Oh, but he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was a genius. No, he wasn't. He was a lion sack of crap. That's what he was. And bullshit artist. That's what he was. So Paul didn't really know the law. David knew the law. And David knew the difference between God's law and man's law. And so, I'm going to suggest to you that when you're reading through the Psalms and you're reading through things as it relates to King David, and he's talking about the law, read it as though, in one of them, I think it's Psalm 119. I love it, where David's like, I want to walk and teach me your law, teach me your ways, teach me your precepts. Like it's the law, the law, the law. He's not meaning the frickin' Levitical law. He's not meaning Pharisaical frickin' rabbi law. He means God's law, natural law, Sinai, Ten Commandments law, the way that God wants things to work. And so, be sure that you're reading that carefully and parsing that carefully, because King David is one of the people that really, really got it. Like he got it and he understood that difference and was always seeking God's law rather than man's law. And I think that's important.
We're going to get in the future on about this law because we have a covenant with God, and it's not just the Paul. And you know, guys all know how I'm having trouble with Paul. He and I have got some things to work out, but there's a lot more than bake cookies, be nice to your neighbor, and say a Jesus prayer. Okay, that ain't the way. Now, if you do that and that's all you do, and you make it to the finish line, all the power to you. I will never judge ever. You'll never hear me judging whether someone is saved or not. That's between you and God, and it has nothing to do with me. But if you can make it to the finish line by being nice to your neighbor and baking cookies and saying a Jesus prayer, all the power to you. Glad to see you in heaven. Can't wait. However, it's a little. I tend to believe it's a little harder than that, and the Bible says it's a little harder than that. And one of the reasons it's a little harder than that
is the word ready. I said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Covenant. 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 People run around and they're like, oh, just say the Jesus prayer and you're good. Go on, Christmas magical sperm Jesus, and everything's great. And then do whatever the hell you want. No. No, 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 no. Jesus would, gross. That's gross to Jesus. Believe me. That's Paulian. That's not Jesus following. Because Jesus was about bringing a new covenant. Or if you go back to, I think it's Isaiah, refreshing the covenant. So why would Jesus be refreshing a covenant? Well, we just talked about the law in summary, right? Cliff notes. And how there's God's law and bullshit post-Babylonian man's law and sacrificial law and all these other laws that bled their way into the Hebrew Israelite society. So refreshing the law of Moses, or the covenant from Sinai, is the new covenant. That's what it is. The new covenant is the old covenant. And a dramatic twist of irony. But people don't think of following Jesus as being in covenant. And if you break the covenant and step outside of the law of the covenant, then you're stepping outside of the kingdom. That makes sense. And that's why Christians, I can't say all, but most Christians have no idea that the kingdom is here. They don't know. They're waiting to do whatever they want, just say Jesus, and then get whisked off and play harps on a cloud and be in heaven or something. And the kingdom's in heaven. No, that's exactly opposite of what Jesus said. Jesus said the kingdom is here. And it makes more sense, I would think, when you start to think of quantum physics and different dimensional shifts and, the veil and all that stuff, makes a whole lot more sense when you see it that way. The kingdom's all around you. You can't see it with your eyes, but the kingdom's here. And that's the good news. When Jesus walked around, he's like, tell him the good news. What's the good news, Jesus? Well, the kingdom's here. Seek ye first the kingdom, and all these things will be added unto you. Seek the kingdom. Jesus didn't walk around going, well, everybody just die and hopefully go to the right place. That's not what the kingdom is. I mean, it is, but it's also here right now, and people are missing it. All the Christians have been fooled by Paul to not understand that the kingdom is active, unfolding as we speak. It's right here. And I think that's a big problem, because if you don't understand that going into covenant in the house of David with Jesus as king in the kingdom of God, you're stamping your passport to enter that kingdom, and you're coming into covenant, and you can't follow the same laws of the kingdom that you just left. So if I move from the United States to Mexico, or if I move from the United States to Saudi, or if I move from the US to, frickin' Greece, I have to follow the laws and the rules of that kingdom, right? Like it or not, you're bound to the rules of that kingdom. Well, it's kind of the same thing. You moving from the kingdom of fleshly, earthly, materialistic, whatever the hell in the kingdom, into God's kingdom. And so there's rules to follow. There's rules to follow in the kingdom. They're not hard. Jesus says, my yoke is easy, right? My yoke is not hard. I will give you rest. I will give you peace. All of those promises of God are yours, not just by default because you said a magical Jesus prayer, but because you're actively walking in the kingdom. And that's why I think David is so important as an Old Testament figure, because he's standing out as a kingdom guy. David was a kingdom guy. Show me your life. Show me how to walk in your kingdom. I know your kingdom, and I want to be part of that kingdom, and I want to learn how to walk in that kingdom. As David the Messiah, David the Anointed, right? um, because people are going to get pissed that I just said Messiah and anointed. But Christos means anointed, and when you play with that language, David was David Christ. He was the chosen Messiah figure, first Messiah, first Christ, if you will, because it just means anointed or chosen king. Now, David wasn't the Messiah, Christ, king of the heavenly kingdom. That's Jesus, right? But David is referred to in the ancient languages as, David the anointed. And he was walking in God's kingdom and trying to learn God's way rather than man's way. And I think Christians need to fucking shape up and start doing it, because they're missing out on the kingdom and they're not walking covered in protection and grace. Why? Because you've stepped outside of the covenant. And so if you're breaking the laws of the covenant, that means you're no longer in covenant. Okay. You've broken your vow. Think of it as like a marriage, right? You don't marry your husband and then run around cheating on him and doing whatever the hell you want. No, you have a husband now. Husbands, you have a wife now. You have to think in relation to these other people, to the other person in that relationship, and keep your covenant, keep your vow. If you're stepping outside of that, it's null and void. Like you just broken the covenant. You broke your promise. You broke your vow. You don't do that with God. So I don't know where these people are getting off, stepping so far out of covenant, not even knowing, not even actually, hold on. Most of them aren't stepping out of covenant because most of them haven't even come into covenant to begin with. So if they haven't come into covenant to begin with, they're not walking in the kingdom to step out of covenant anyway. And we do actually get pretty deep into this idea of covenant in the baptism series. It's a little 2-video series that we do on baptism and baptism as a covenant rather than a church tradition or magic words, magic water ritual, where it's actually a significant portion of coming into covenant and where that comes from and what it means. And we do all that in the baptism series, so catch that. I think that one's already up. So you like, get your shit together, Christians. Get your shit together. Be like David. Be like David. Because if you're out of covenant or have never entered into covenant, regardless of what you may think, you ain't covered in grace.
And you do that with prayer. You do that with praying that God shows you the right path and the right way and the right words and the right shit to do during your day. Okay. And, that's part of that is repentance. Part of that is asking for direction and keeping that forefront in your mind, which is the hardest part, is remembering and keeping it forward in your mind, and how to stand in that law and in that grace and in the natural order of things. When you do that, your blessings will multiply a billion. You're walking around with your dick swinging around and your fucking, assholery, and you're not repenting, you're not following the law, you're not getting to know God, right? When you are able to feel like God is your friend and you can laugh with them and be completely authentic, I think authenticity before God is a really good measure of your relationship with God. Kind of relationship where you're just laughing and yelling and doing all the things that you would normally do in any other relationship, and you approach God that way, that's a good measure. And that's what he wants, is he wants you to love him, and you can't love him if you don't know him and know his character. Okay. Verse 3, this says it yields the fruit in its season, not in season, but in its season, meaning God's timing. Okay. So be sure that you're yielding fruit and being patient for God's timing and God's way. And even if things look shitty, he's going to turn it around anyways. And he might not turn it around for you. It might always suck for you, but it's doing something bigger for his larger spider web plan that you were a critical role in. So keep that in mind. We don't harvest fruits when we want them. The fruits come when God wants them. And there again is that by streams of water. And that's Jesus with the water. Again, we always talk about the water thing. That word by sort of underscores it. It means like the roots are right there in the life-giving water. This isn't just a tree planted somewhere next to a stream. This is like the roots are going down right into that life-giving water. Okay, so that's important in verse 3. We talked about the wicked. They are the chaff. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Now, the chaff is that little outside. I want you guys to think of corn. Wheat is very much like corn, where the good stuff's, the little seeds are on the inside. And then you've got that cover, just like a cob of corn. And like the green leaves that you have to yank off before you put the corn on the cob into the cooker. All right, well, that's exactly how wheat and chaff is. Chaff is the outside covering that sort of smothers the wheat or hides the wheat or covers the wheat. And when I read this, I immediately think of all the negative energy and entities that crawl all over you and smother your beautiful light. Okay, so that's like the chaff. But the wind's gonna blow it away. Now, the threshing floor is really interesting. The threshing floor is a giant room. I want you to think of like a man cave, but like in a giant basement, right? And they've got these huge sifter things, and they're like and shaking the fuck out of these things of wheat to get all of the oogies off of the covering in order to pull out the good stuff. Okay, so it's like sifting that away. And that was definitely a sweaty, burly, yummy man's job. And so women were usually not allowed on the threshing floor. And it was, and I don't want to say violent, but it was pretty fucking aggressive in the way that they used to shake that off. And I want you to kind of see like these big burly yummy men on the threshing floor just like beating the fuck out of that wheat to get the chaff off it. And that sort of reminds me of the power of the angels in the council and of God Himself when they say, the end of the age. The wicked will not stand in the judgment. That doesn't mean that they're not going to have judgment. That means that they're not going to remain standing in the judgment. Like the judgment's going to come and people are going to stop dropping like fucking flies, and they're not going to be the last man standing in that judgment time. Okay, only the righteous. Nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. That's referring actually to the righteous sons of God or the Elohim that are serving God, not necessarily the assembly of the good people, but of the good heavenly spirits. Okay. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous or the path of the righteous. And the word for the Lord in this one's interesting. That's Adonai, which is the creator. So it's the creator of all things watches over the way of the righteous. But the way of the wicked leads to destruction. So my question is, as you think of wicked and evil in our world these days, um, I don't want you guys to feel as though you always have to be nice. Okay. So please don't always be nice. You don't want to make friends with the enemy. Now, I'm fucking all ornery about it, and I'm like, yeah, fuck you. But, that's me. You don't have to be as ornery as I am. But don't buy the lie that you can commune, if you will, with wickedness or wrongness, and you need to play along just so you can be the nice Christian that bakes cookies. Like, oh, one of the first things they say, you should see me when I fucking unleash. I'm a fucking asshole. And people are like, oh, that's not very Christian of you. I'm like, oh, contraire, wicked one. You fucking den of vipers. It sure the fuck is Christian as all fucking day. Back off, motherfucker. And it kind of blows their mind that I'm that much of an asshole. And also,
Following Jesus and God's law, not man's law, not man's law, not religious law, God's law, natural law, Moses' law, not crap the Christians made up and call it law.
because I don't play with wickedness. I don't. I'm going to walk in grace. I'm going to stay covered in grace. And I'm going to call out some bullshit when I see it. And I don't have to be nice about it all the time. Doesn't mean you have to be mean all the time. But don't feel like you have to tolerate wickedness or things that, even not wicked, even things that just step out of God's order and God's hierarchy and the way that He has things to be. You don't have to play ball and be nice just because someone else said so. So don't feel guilty about that. And the alternate verse is pretty long. And I just put in Matthew, not all of Matthew 13, but a bunch of Matthew 13, which is Jesus talking in parables. And this is the parable of the wheat and the tares. And I put kind of the whole thing there for you to read through. But I definitely just wanted to pull out this verse that says, let both, meaning the wheat and the tares, grow together until the harvest. And at the time of harvest, I'll say to the reapers, who are the angels, by the way, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Okay, so that's sort of all that same imagery of the wheat and the tares, and how they will be gathered and separated. But notice how it says, let them grow together until the end. Okay, so if you're going to be growing around a bunch of fucking weeds all the way through your life, be able to identify the weeds, and like you don't have to become one. And that's the purpose of Psalm 1. Also, it talks about how the parables are prophecies, and I thought that was interesting as to why the hell does Jesus fucking talk in parables to begin with, and that's in there. And it refers back to Psalm 78, which is a prophecy that the guy who comes is going to talk in fucking parables all the time. And so there he is fulfilling prophecy. A lot of people don't know that. So I noted that. That comes from Psalm 78, which was the prophecy about the Messiah speaking in parables. And he's like, yo, I do that because it says I was going to do it and it's showing you this prophecy. Okay. Finally, I put in Jesus's explanation of the parable of the tares. And he's pretty brutal. He is pretty brutal from Matthew 13. I don't want to go into right now. I could for hours on this parable. So otherwise, I would talk about all the times that people are not allowed to look on the face of God, even in their righteousness, and how interesting that is. And I would go into the Shroud of Turin and the absolute mind blowing amount of light, energy, and radiation that would take to do that scientific thing when you really dig into the science. And I would talk about those blasts of light again and how difficult it is if you're not attuned to that, and how Moses had to hide. Um, he had to hide his face behind the rock, and just all the things through the whole Old Testament, how people couldn't look at God, or they would die on the spot. And I kind of think of that when I think of heaven and hell and how your energies, frequencies are attuned to it. Because if you are basking in God's light and you know God and you have pulled that energy of God into your life and you've been walking in grace through, repentance and meditation, having a relationship with God, then you're going to be much more attuned to that energy. And if you're not, it's going to feel like really beautiful sunshine on your face. But if you're not, it's going to fucking hurt like hell because you're just not attuned to that frequency. So if you think in terms of frequency, I could go off on that for a million years, but I'm not going to.
And the I never knew you, the most terrifying sentence in the Bible, in my opinion, is, when Jesus says so many people are going to say, but I did all this stuff in the, happy Christmas Jesus name. Very much like Paul did, by the way, when the Pharisees the exorcists who were using Solomonic magic, came along and said that they tried to perform an exorcism using the name of the Jesus Paul preached, and it didn't work. They got their asses beat. There's that. And, Paul couldn't get the demons even out of himself. God supposedly refused. Just said, no, we're going to leave that demon there for you, Paul. Does that sound like your Jesus? My Jesus would not do. So there's all that. With the I never knew you and weeping and gnashing of teeth, and you're dialing the wrong number, and the wheat and the tares and the sheep and the goats, and the sheep follow Jesus, not church, not religion, not Paul, not anything else. But that's a whole read the book. Gotta read the book. Because we're not. But you know what? You can't read the book. You have to listen to the book because it's not really a book. But we wrote it and it's here read to you on the channel. So go listen to that. And we go deep into many of those things. And we'll also address them in upcoming series. Doing that, and then that leads into Gehenna versus hell. And how that, Jesus taught Gehenna, but the church teaches hell, and they're two different things. And I think they're conflating. I say I think they're conflating because I don't know what the hell modern Christians are doing, but clearly not reading their Bible. So I think they're getting this burning inferno idea of everlasting torture from like medieval stuff, like with Dante's Inferno or whatever the heck, and then kind of marrying that whole idea with Revelation, where, people are thrown into the pit, and it's like, the eternal fire in Revelation. But but here's the thing. The everlasting pit of fire, or, hurling all the wicked into the lake of fire, if you will, from the book of Revelation, that's associated with the, ready, here it is, second death. Not the second you blew your chance and you're going to be tortured forever. Didn't say that. The second death. So the first death would be physical death, and the second death would be soul death, which makes sense considering that the first birth is physical birth, and the second rebirth, it would be the spiritual birth with the baptism and coming into covenant. And so it's like the same thing. Kind of mirrors each other there. It's kind of handy how God does that, and Jesus teaches that. It's just adds right up. So there's that. So do with that what you will, but we're not going through all that today. And there it is.
So enjoy Psalm 1, and I will see you next time.